At Ruby's Grill, a dusty roadside cafe clinging to the edge of Brook Hollow, the air smelled perpetually of fried patties and fresh coffee, thick enough to stain the curtains and settle into the cracks of the weathered linoleum floor. The clock above the counter ticked with a lethargic patience, unnoticed by the handful of regulars hunched over their plates, lost in the familiar ritual of mid-morning meals and half-hearted conversation. The grill hissed and sputtered behind the counter, a tired symphony of everyday life. The door creaked open, and a gust of dry, dusty wind carried in an elderly man. He walked slowly, leaving faint prints across the scuffed floor. His boots were cracked and tired, laces frayed to almost nothing, but they carried him forward with a quiet determination. He wore worn jeans patched at the knees and a battered army jacket, its faded olive cloth frayed at the cuffs, bearing silent witness to decades long past. The kind of jacket that seemed less like clothing and more like armor against a world that had long since moved on without him. Conversations dwindled. Forks hovered midair. A few patrons exchanged glances, their whispers rising like smoke. Drifter. Beggar. Some nobody looking for a free meal. Their judgments floated freely in the air, unspoken but heavy. Behind the counter, Dean, the young bartender barely out of high school, frowned openly, watching the man approach. His eyes narrowed slightly, calculating whether it was worth the trouble to serve someone who might not even be able to pay. The old man approached the counter without hesitation, his gait unhurried, his presence unassuming yet strangely grounded. He sat at the far end, near the window, where the sunlight caught in the smudges on the glass. His hands, gnarled and calloused, counted out a small pile of coins onto the counter, each one clinking softly. Enough for a cup of coffee and a simple sandwich. No more, no less. His name was Walter Granger. Walt, to the few who still remembered. At 83 years old, he lived in the ragged farmhouse on the outskirts of Brook Hollow, a house no one visited anymore. Children made up stories about the place, haunted, they said, or cursed. Adults dismissed him as a stubborn relic who had outlived his usefulness. Some thought he was just another poor farmer, clinging to the wreckage of a forgotten life. None knew the full truth, and fewer still cared to ask. Walt carried the loneliness of years like a second skin. Each morning, he tended to a handful of chickens and an aging dog named Scout. Each evening, he sat on his porch watching the field stretch out endlessly beneath a bruised sky, a thermos of lukewarm coffee resting beside him. His days were a quiet, steady march, uncelebrated, unremarkable. He didn't speak much. Words, after all, had long since proven themselves inadequate for the things he had seen, the things he had carried home locked deep in his chest. Instead, he found comfort in small rituals, the creak of the porch swing, the scrape of a hoe against dry soil, the simple act of ordering coffee at Ruby's Grill. A quiet rebellion against fading away entirely. On the radio behind the counter, the morning news crackled about Brook Hollow's upcoming Day of Heroes celebration. Mayor Linda Evans was urging residents to submit names of local veterans for a special town ceremony. Dean rolled his eyes and turned down the volume. Most of the regulars barely paid attention. After all, everyone already knew which handful of polished, smiling veterans would be trotted out for the parade. The ones with clean uniforms and neatly framed photographs. The ones who fit comfortably into speeches and ceremonies. Somewhere in the corner, a teenager snickered and nudged his friend. Loud enough for a few tables to hear, he joked about nominating the old man sitting alone at the counter. Wouldn't it be hilarious? Give the dusty scarecrow his 5 minutes of glory. A few others chuckled, the laughter brittle and easy, the way it always is when aimed at someone they assume can't hear, or worse, won't dare to answer back. And so the nomination was made, half as a joke, a few scribbled lines submitted at City Hall without a second thought. A kindness offered not out of respect, but out of mockery. Like tossing a bone to a stray dog. At City Hall, Sophie Miller, the mayor's young assistant, dutifully processed the forms. Walt Granger. She blinked at the name, unfamiliar, and ran the standard checks against public military records. Nothing appeared. No service number. No discharge papers. No medals, no parades, no grand stories. Following protocol, she marked the submission for federal verification, fully expecting it to be quietly discarded. But 2 days later, a government courier arrived with a manila envelope, sealed with red tape and a stark label, "For mayor's eyes only." Inside, heavily redacted documents revealed fragments of a life few could have imagined. Walter Granger had served. Not just in name, not just in some peacetime garrison, but deep in the heart of the Cold War's most secret operations. Missions that remained locked under presidential order. Honors awarded in closed ceremonies. Acts of sacrifice whose details would likely never see the light of day. The mayor sat back in her chair, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on her. Brook Hollow had misjudged one of its own. Not an eccentric farmer. Not a beggar. A guardian hidden in plain sight. Yet outside her office, life carried on unbothered. At Ruby's Grill, Walt finished his coffee, carefully tucking the receipt into his jacket pocket. The glass of water beside him, half empty, caught the sunlight and threw pale patterns across the counter. He sat there a moment longer, as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. Then he rose, tugged his jacket tight against the wind, and walked out into the afternoon, his boots leaving new tracks on the worn floor. No one stopped him. No one thought to ask his name. But soon, the whole town would learn it, and nothing in Brook Hollow would ever be quite the same again. The day after Walt Granger left Ruby's Grill, the town of Brook Hollow turned its attention fully to preparations for the Day of Heroes. Every telephone pole and storefront was soon dressed in red, white, and blue ribbons, fluttering weakly in the autumn wind. The old town square, with its cracked concrete and tired oak trees, was getting a rust makeover, paint covering rust, banners covering cracks. Pride stitched hastily over years of neglect. At City Hall, the atmosphere was more routine than celebratory. Sophie Miller sat at her desk, sorting through the stacks of nomination forms with mechanical precision. Most names were familiar, scrawled in the same heavy pens of civic pride: decorated sons, retired sergeants, proud grandfathers. It was work easily done on autopilot, until she stumbled again on the name submitted as a joke: Walter Granger. Her fingers hesitated over the form, the paper lighter somehow, as if it carried the mocking laughter that had placed it there. She sighed and pulled up the town's veteran database, typing the name in without much hope. As expected, no record appeared. Nothing to indicate that Walt had ever worn a uniform, much less earned the title of veteran in the way the town preferred its heroes: polished, documented, parade-ready. Still, rules were rules. Forms without immediate confirmation had to be escalated to a higher authority. Sophie opened the old Department of Defense request portal, filled in Walt's name, his approximate age, his last known address, the ramshackle farm no one visited, and clicked submit. A bureaucratic gesture. An empty formality. Outside her office window, the children of Brook Hollow practiced their flag routines in the park, laughing and shouting, wooden batons flashing in the sun. No one thought about the weight of real service, of real sacrifice. For most, patriotism was an easy tradition, a harmless costume pulled from the closet once a year. 2 days later, on a drizzly Wednesday morning, a black government sedan rolled quietly into town. It parked not at City Hall's front steps, but discreetly around back. A man in a dark suit stepped out, carrying a simple manila envelope tucked tightly under one arm. He entered the building without speaking to anyone and requested to see Mayor Evans immediately. The envelope was heavy in the mayor's hands. Its seal, marked "For mayor's eyes only," made her breath hitch slightly. She slid it open with the edge of her ruler, feeling a sudden, inexplicable dread. Inside were several documents. Pages and pages, almost entirely blacked out. Lines of text reduced to thick black bars. But the pieces left visible told enough of a story to silence any lingering doubt. Walter Granger had not only served, he had served in ways that most could not fathom. His file listed participation in classified Cold War operations so sensitive that even the details of his medals, numerous and significant, remained under strict presidential lock and key. His sacrifices had not been public ones, and by design, they never would be. The mayor sat back in her chair, the office spinning slightly around her. Outside, the town bustled with shallow preparations for a ceremony that had, until now, felt almost performative. She stared at the name again, printed in simple type, Walter E. Granger. A name passed over 100 times in town meetings, parades, and memorial services. A man dismissed as a relic, a shadow drifting through the edges of Brook Hollow's vision. Word leaked, as it always does in small towns, though no one could pin down exactly how. Perhaps it was the arrival of the government car. Perhaps a city hall clerk glimpsed the blacked-out files. Whatever the reason, within hours, murmurs swirled around Ruby's Grill, the hardware store, even the elementary school pickup lines. Whispers that the old man in the jacket was not just some poor farmer. That maybe, just maybe, the town had overlooked a true giant hidden in plain sight. At the diner, Dean wiped the counter more vigorously than necessary, casting nervous glances at the door every time it opened. He remembered the frown he had worn when Walt had counted his coins 2 mornings before. He remembered, too, the small, sinking feeling that came with realizing he had measured a man's worth by the weight of his wallet. The regulars spoke in hushed tones, their coffee growing cold. Some pretended they had always known. Some claimed they had suspected something, though no one had treated Walt any better when he sat quietly among them, invisible in his humility. At the edge of town, the fields around Walt's farmhouse stood silent and golden in the late afternoon light. Scout, the old dog, barked half-heartedly at the passing breeze. Walt himself sat on the porch, a blanket draped over his knees, the battered army jacket still hugging his frame against the chill. The thermos at his side steamed faintly. He watched the horizon with the patience of someone who had seen centuries unfold in the span of a single lifetime. He felt no different. He had lived the same way for decades, rooted, unseen, asking for nothing. If he noticed the unusual activity in town, the quickened pace, the furtive stares, he gave no sign. He simply sipped his coffee, his gaze stretching out beyond the fields, beyond the limits of Brook Hollow. To places only he remembered. To battles fought in silence, for a world that never knew how close it had come to losing itself. The town was preparing a parade. Walter Granger was preparing for another sunset. Neither knew just how deeply their paths were about to cross. The morning of the Day of Heroes arrived with a solemn chill in the air, as if even the weather understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Thin mist clung to the fields beyond Brook Hollow, and the few trees that lined the main street stood like silent sentries, their leaves trembling in the breeze. Shopkeepers dusted off their window displays, and small American flags fluttered in the hands of children weaving between the adults who gathered early at the town square. There was a different kind of energy in the crowd this year. A low hum of tension, of whispered guesses and half-finished sentences. Something was happening. Something bigger than the usual speeches and photo ops. No one quite knew what, but everyone could feel it, as surely as they could feel the cold seeping through their jackets. A makeshift stage had been erected at the center of the square, dressed in patriotic bunting. Rows of folding chairs stood neatly in front of it, already half-filled with town council members, aging veterans in uniform, and families clutching hot coffee in paper cups. At the very front sat Mayor Linda Evans, her face composed but her heart pounding. In her lap rested a small black folder containing one name, printed simply, Walter E. Granger. At precisely 10 a.m., the low rumble of engines shattered the early quiet. 4 black SUVs, polished to a mirror shine, rolled into the square. They moved with precision, parking in formation along the curb. Doors swung open in unison, and men in dark suits emerged, earpieces tucked discreetly against their necks, their gazes scanning the gathering crowd with professional detachment. Conversations died instantly. Children stopped fidgeting. Even the restless fluttering of flags seemed to pause midair. Brook Hollow had never seen such a sight, an arrival more fitting for heads of state than for a small-town ceremony. From the lead vehicle stepped a man whose posture alone commanded respect. His uniform was crisp, adorned with ribbons and badges, yet he wore no expression of pride, only a kind of grave sincerity. General Matthew Raines, a name few recognized but whose presence carried the full weight of the Department of Defense. Without preamble, the general mounted the stage. The mayor rose to greet him, her hands trembling slightly as she handed over the microphone. He took it with a nod, surveying the faces before him, curious, expectant, some nervous, many unaware of the full gravity of what they were about to witness. When he spoke, his voice was deep and steady, cutting through the cold morning air. Today, we gather to honor not only our known heroes but one among us whose service was rendered in silence, whose sacrifices were made without applause, without parades, and without the comfort of public gratitude. A ripple moved through the crowd, confusion, curiosity, a growing sense of awe. This individual's actions, the general continued, shaped the lives of countless Americans, though his story remains locked in the highest vaults of our nation's history. Today, we break that silence, not by revealing the missions he undertook, but by recognizing the spirit in which they were performed, duty, honor, and selflessness beyond measure. The general paused. The silence in the square was so profound that even the rustle of paper banners seemed to still in reverence. "Walter E. Granger," he said, his voice lowering slightly, as if invoking a sacred name, "please come forward." At first, no one moved. Heads turned, seeking the familiar figure. And then, from the edge of the square, stepping quietly between the folding chairs, came Walt. His boots, cracked and dusty, tread a careful path across the cold ground. His battered jacket caught the weak sunlight, the faded colors looking almost regal against the backdrop of polished uniforms and gleaming medals. As he walked, veterans in the audience slowly rose to their feet. One by one, without a word, they stood at attention, their hands pressed over their hearts or forming trembling salutes. No one had to tell them. They recognized something in Walt that needed no explanation, an invisible weight carried with grace, a silent oath kept longer than most could imagine. Children watched with wide eyes. Parents found themselves holding their breath. Even those who had once whispered and laughed at the old man now sat frozen, faces flushed with shame or wonder, or both. When Walt reached the stage, the general met him with a salute that was not ceremonial, but deeply personal. Walt, with the steady dignity that had carried him through unseen wars, returned it. From the black folder, the mayor withdrew a document bearing the seal of the President of the United States. It was not a medal that could be worn, nor a citation that could be recited at length. It was a simple letter, acknowledging exceptional service rendered under conditions that would never be made public. The general read a portion aloud. To Walter E. Granger, whose courage and sacrifice during the silent battles of the Cold War embody the truest spirit of American service, your loyalty, your perseverance, and your unwavering sense of duty have safeguarded freedoms unseen and lives uncounted. He turned and handed the letter to Walt. For a moment, the old man simply stared at it, the paper shaking slightly in his hands, not from fear or pride, but from the enormity of being seen after so many years of deliberate invisibility. The crowd erupted into applause. It started awkwardly, uncertainly, then grew, gaining strength, rolling through the square in a wave that seemed to wash away years of neglect and misunderstanding. Tears glistened in the eyes of men who had once judged. Children who had never looked twice at the dusty old man now tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking, "Is he a hero?" And somewhere at the back of the crowd, near the alleyway, Dean from Ruby's Grill stood very still, his throat tight. He remembered the way he had frowned at Walt's coins. Remembered the disdain he had allowed himself to feel. Now, it burned inside him, a scar he would carry far longer than any childhood embarrassment. Walt stood on the stage, the applause washing over him, through him, beyond him. He did not smile, nor did he weep. He simply stood, as he always had, solid, enduring, silent. There was no need for speeches. The man who had once guarded the world in silence had finally been heard. Long after the last echo of applause faded into the brisk autumn air, the people of Brook Hollow remained changed in ways they couldn't yet articulate. The ceremony ended, the chairs were folded, the banners taken down, but something invisible lingered, stitched into the fabric of the town like a new and sacred thread. At Ruby's Grill, where Walt had once been viewed with suspicion and impatience, a plaque was quietly installed above his favorite seat at the counter. The brass was simple and unadorned, but the words were enough to silence anyone who read them. "The man you mistook for a beggar was guarding your freedom in silence." No one joked there anymore. The whispers had been replaced by careful, reverent glances toward the empty stool where Walt sometimes still sat, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, his eyes drifting thoughtfully to the horizon beyond the smudged windows. The heart of Brook Hollow, too, changed. In the center of the town square, where annual festivals and markets were usually held, a new memorial was installed. Walt had been asked what inscription he would prefer. Officials had offered him grand suggestions, quoting presidents and generals. He declined them all with a quiet shake of his head. His only request was that the words be few and true. To those who defended quietly. The stone was cut without fanfare, its surface left rough on purpose, as if to reflect the unfinished, unseen battles it honored. In a gesture that surprised even the oldest residents, the annual parade route was changed permanently. No longer would it begin at the courthouse or the high school. From now on, the march would start at the fence line of Walt's worn, sprawling farm, where the earth met the endless sky. Each year, the colors of the flag would first catch the morning sun above Walt's fields, the very soil he had returned to after doing his part to guard a world he would never speak of. As the months rolled by, these tributes became less ceremony and more living memory. Children asked their parents about the man in the jacket. Teachers added a small lesson to the history curriculum, that not all heroes lived in textbooks, and not all battles ended with medals and ticker-tape parades. Some ended on front porches, in lonely fields, under forgotten skies. Dean, the young bartender from Ruby's Grill, found the weight of his earlier judgment harder to shake than he expected. One cold evening, gathering all the courage he could, he drove out to Walt's farm, parking near the leaning mailbox with the faded numbers. He brought no speech, no rehearsed apology. Instead, he walked to the edge of the pasture where Walt was mending a broken fence, the old dog scout sleeping in the grass nearby. Without a word, Dean picked up a second hammer from the toolbox and began to help. They worked in silence as the sun sank behind the hills, the rhythmic pounding of nails speaking more honestly than words ever could. In each lift of the hammer, in each shared task, something was mended that no apology alone could fix. Seasons turned. Snow came, then melted into spring rains. The town settled into its new rhythm, bearing the invisible imprint of one man's life. Tourists would sometimes stop at the historical museum where a small exhibit had been arranged. Encased behind clean glass sat a pair of cracked, dust-worn boots, and beside them, Walt's old army jacket, the stitching on the name patch nearly worn away. A simple card beneath the display read, "These boots stood on ground you will never see but must never forget." Walt Granger himself remained much the same. He still rose with the sun. Still tended the stubborn patch of earth he called home. His jacket still carried the scent of wood smoke and morning dew. But when he walked into town now, he was greeted not with wary glances, but with quiet nods, respectful smiles, and sometimes, when the mood was right, a hand laid gently over a heart in silent salute. He asked for no fame. No riches. No comfort beyond the small joys he had always known, the warmth of a fresh cup of coffee, the slow turning of the seasons, the familiar weight of Scout resting his head against Walt's knee. Sometimes, at dusk, he would sit on his porch with the fading sky stretching wide before him, the thermos by his side steaming in the cool air. He would watch the stars prick through the velvet darkness, one by one, remembering faces and places he would never name aloud. Battles won and lost without monuments, without anniversaries, known only to the men who had fought them and carried their scars into the silent, unseen corners of history. Brook Hollow had given Walt a plaque, a parade, and a page in the museum, but the real honor was quieter, stitched into the way neighbors treated one another, the way children paused a little longer at the sight of a weathered old jacket, understanding that greatness often wears the plainest of clothes. Walter Granger lived the remainder of his days in the same quiet dignity that had carried him through 1,000 unseen storms. When the time finally came, years later, there was no grand announcement, no headlines. Just a simple note posted on the diner's bulletin board. Walter E. Granger, a man who lived for others and asked nothing in return. The bell at Ruby's grill chimed softly every time the door opened, a gentle reminder that sometimes heroes don't arrive in uniforms pressed and polished, but in dust-covered boots and battered jackets, carrying with them the invisible weight of a grateful world. Kindness without question is enough.